This is House Planning Help episode 237. Hi there, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and try to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Richard Dudzicki from RDA Architects, and we've got a case study of their passive house Muse development in Camberwell, London. Quick story about approaching that, because I like to do interviews in person where I can. So I went into the nearest train station I could find, and I was just starting to walk up a hill, and there aren't that many hills in London. I just had this inkling. Am I getting close to Walter's Way? I don't know whether you've heard of Walter Seagull, a renowned architect, late 70s, early 80s. Hopefully I'm right in that ballpark there. And Walter's Way, quite famous. It was council housing, but self-build council housing. I think they're all privately owned these days. Timber frame, really easy to put up. An amazing sense of community as well. And so when I was walking up this, I think I'm approaching that. I don't know how I even knew that. I didn't really look at the map. I guess I knew roughly southeast London. It's going to be the right area, and just thought, hold on, yeah, this seems similar to some mini YouTube video I've seen where there's drone shots and all the rest of it. And sure enough, came around the corner and there it was. So that was quite nice in the approach to this interview, to walk up that hill, although it is a mighty hill. I had to do the whole of it and then come down the other side. So let's get to the interview with Richard Dudzicki. And I've bumped into him a few times when we've been filming for the UK Passive House Awards. I think he's been shortlisted 3 times. I've visited 2 of those projects and really like them. Very well finished, very beautiful, very cleverly designed. And I think this might be a common factor that they've all been on very tight urban plots. So it makes sense that in this podcast, we discover a bit more about how he deals with sites like this. The budget's really tight on this one for central London too. So lots of great tips coming your way. Also, it's a SIPs build, and recently we've done a few on build systems, so it's nice to focus in on this is SIPs specifically. He's done a few this way, so what has he learnt about it? I started by asking Richard, though, to tell me a little bit about his background.
I grew up in the sort of 60s and 70s going to building sites. My father's a retired architect in his 90s now. And my brother's an architect in Australia, so I come from a family of architects, and we all do very different things. My father did commercial, my brother does hospitals, and I do residential. Hence, I've gone down the passive house route. Prior to that, it was ecological buildings, and it was green buildings, but I've gone down this route because I just think it's the most practical way of achieving your goals, and it gives you pure physics that tells you this is what the house is going to do. This is how it's going to perform. So what we find with the majority of all of that is that it gives us results.
The Muse development is quite interesting because this is the second project on the same Muse street. So is that just coincidence or recommendation from the neighbour?
It's recommendations, plus it's not the second project. It's actually the 4th house we've done on that road.
Wow. Does that happen very often, that this sort of thing?
Well, no, for us it does actually. We've got another road in London where I think on our 7th or 8th project. That's all quite large-scale projects.
Can you explain a little bit about the site then?
The site itself is in a very historic part of London. It's in Camberwell, and it's just around the back of Camberwell Grove, which was built really as soon as the railway started coming out. It was one of the first sort of Georgian streets in London that dealt with suburban living and living to fresher air and better air. It's an amazing street. It's quite beautiful. And Stories Muse is the street which runs behind it, which used to be the old coach house street for the big mansions. The buildings on the main road are Grade 2 listed, whilst where we built the passive house, that's all falls within the conservation area. And there's also quite a prolific, if I'd say, element of a society which is called the Camberwell Society, which tries to preserve and maintain, as well as the Conservation Department from planning. The type of geology there is it's all clay. So you've got London clay, And that does lead to a few problems. There's a lot of old mature trees. So you've got a hell of a lot of trees, which does cause a lot of subsidence. And, that doesn't really cause for subsidence, because subsidence is caused by the poor foundations that were put in 150 years ago. And also the fact that the trees have grown so much, which you can't blame the trees for that. So that's pretty much the site.
What exactly was on the brief for this from the client's perspective?
The client, really interesting lady. She's in her later part of her life. She's in her 70s, yet she still runs a business. And she's a physiotherapist, and she runs a fairly successful physiotherapy practice, one in Harley Street and the other one in East Dulwich. We've converted an old factory and made a Pilates studio and gym for her in the past. And so we've done a few bits and pieces for her. But her boys have left home now. They're in their 40s. And so obviously they've left a wee while ago. And she lives in one of these big houses, or she used to live in one of these big houses, and Georgian house, which was too big, 5-6 bedrooms, with a sort of granny flat on the ground in the basement, effectively an annex, which is where she started her practice from. And it just got too big, too cold, too drafty, and the bills were high, and so forth. And the money that she would spend on doing up the big house would be the same as taking a certain section of her garden off. She'd seen what we'd done up the road, and she came to me and said, I'd like a really nice modern house, 3 bedrooms, parking for a car off street, lots of light, and I want a courtyard in it. I looked at the size of the site, roughly 5.5 metres wide by about 8 or 10 metres deep. I said, look, Elizabeth, I think that's going to be very difficult. Oh, and the other factor, she said, I've only got 250,000 to spend. I sort of worked that out. That's sort of, if you work that out, you sort of think to yourself, well, that's about, for the sort of brief, you've got about 120 square metres, £2,000 a square metre. Yeah, it's just about doable. But that's really tight. But I thought it was possible because I built my house, which I built 10 years prior to this, for about 150 grand. So I said it was possible, and we discussed it. But then I said, there will have to be compromise. And the compromise was very much on the scale of what I could do and what I couldn't do. The compromise was also restricted through planning and conservation. There was a compromise there. So our first design, to keep the budget tight, was designed with render on the outside as opposed to brick. And we made an application, and everyone was up in arms that it was rendered. And we were using render to save on costs. So that's really how the design developed. I mean, I can talk about how it developed from a planning point of view. And so from a planning point of view, we took the street and the industrial landscape, or the light industrial landscape that was there before, and we had to apply a certain amount of this towards the fabric of what we were trying to create. So the scale was a lot lower to a Georgian building, and the planners, conservation department, Camberwell Society certainly didn't want to mock pastiche of a Georgian building. They wanted something which was of the time. Whilst we were developing the planning, at that stage I'd managed to persuade Elizabeth to perhaps look at Passivhaus. And of course she was worried about this, and I said, look, don't be worried, it's a fantastic thing. And she was worried about extra expense and extra money, and whether you could open the windows or not. All the standard things that people hear on Passivhaus. I explained to her, there's one 5 doors away, have a look. And she had a look at that, and she said, well, it seems like a normal house. And I said, it is. And there was nothing abnormal about it. And I said, that's exactly what I would be doing, because you want a house, you want to live in the same area, you don't want to move from where your house, your existing place is. You're in your 70s, this is your final place that you're going to live in. Make a Passivhaus, you'll have no bother for the next 20 odd years or more. Anyway, I managed to persuade her, but the problem occurred really was with budgets. And at that stage, she also said, "Oh, by the way, I've bought myself a training pool." I said, "Sorry?" She goes, "I've bought a training pool and I've put a deposit on for a swimming pool." I said, "Where are we going to put this?" And she said, "Well, I want it in the garden. And, I'm a physiotherapist and I want a swimming pool. Well, I've gone to a show and they've given me this amazing deal on a prefab training pool." So I said, "Right, how do you heat this?" And we had to go through the whole issue of how it was heated. Fortunately, it didn't fall within the envelope of the building, so that was something we could deal with. But we did design it in such a way that the solar panels on the roof of the house provide enough energy to run that pool throughout, to run the pool. That's not to heat it. And she has bought herself a wetsuit now. And
so what else does the solar PV do in the house before it's exported?
The solar PV provides energy for the running of the pool. It's on a feedback tariff, so there's a certain amount of energy that is reused effectively. So it's just got a standard Valiant combi boiler on there and a number of solar panels. But that was sort of something that we took into account when we were looking at the PHPP. We also... sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit.
That was me. I took you off track. I was just interested while you were connecting up solar PV. I was but step back.
Right, step back a little bit. I think from a planning perspective, she also wanted a parking space, and parking space was for a fairly large car. I said, well, all cars are going to be electric. Let's design it for an electric car. So we designed it for the size of a Toyota Prius, not a smart car or anything. I was trying to design it for a smart car. Because the road is an unmade road, the local authority insisted that we have off-street parking. And that's one of the criteria that was a necessity. That caused a lot of problems with the building envelope. Because the building envelope, if you think of it as a rectangular box, suddenly has an area which is taken out of it on the ground floor for a sort of garagey space. Now, the house isn't wide enough to have a garage and a door, so we used it as a sort of internal courtyard, an external space. So it was outside the thermal envelope. Now, that meant that we had a larger surface area exposed to the cold, which meant that we had to beef up the amount of insulation. By beefing up the amount of insulation, it added on to cost. So this external parking space did cause us quite a lot of issues. The cost was still within the budget. We still built the house for less than $250, but that was one of the things that it did add probably about £6,000 or £7,000 more in terms of the additional insulation that we had to wrap the building with. And we started very early on modelling it in PHPP, and it took sort of 1.5 attempts to get it through planning, and we were fairly successful fairly quickly. And one of the logistical items when we were designing the building package, once we'd got the planning and dealing with party wall issues and all the other statutory approvals that one needs to do, was really how we would get everything to site. And really that's where the SIPs panels came in. So we designed it in such a way that it would do it in 3 lifts. Due to the complexity and difficulty of the site, I worked alongside a supplier who I've worked with before, supplying Kingspan SIPs panels, and we got a price of £47,000 for the whole erection of the building. That's from ground floor, roof, all the structural aspects of it, including the insulation, which was quite reasonable at the time. We had cheaper quotes, but I'd worked with these guys before and I thought they were quite reasonable. And I knew that the product would be the genuine Kingspan product. And that was something I was quite insistent on. But having been to the Kingspan factory and seeing how ecological their approach was and how they didn't really waste anything or waste very little. Maybe both myself and James were sold a load of spiel, but it all looked really, really good.
So what are the pros and cons of the SIPs as you see it?
Right, the pros are speed. You don't need to borrow the money for a long time because you can be working the drive very quickly. So once you've done the groundwork and foundations, you can have a house up in maybe 2 or 3 weeks. The next item is logistics. By it being done very quickly, you haven't got a lot of disruption. The street outside is only wide enough really for one or two cars, well, one car really, and if there's a lorry parked outside loading up, and remember my site is 5.5 metres wide and 10 metres deep, there's no room to move. So if there's a lorry unloading, we've got lots of grab lorries. Well, we can't even get a grab lorry down there basically, that's how tight the site was. We had to do it in small trucks. The small 7.5 tonne trucks could take the SIPs panels, unload it, put it in the middle of the site, and the building would be built from the middle of the site around the perimeter. Next floor would go up. As the floor would go up, the internal partitions would go on for the ground floor for the next one. So effectively, the whole building was erected in about 3 weeks, 2.5, 3 weeks.
You have to add insulation, am I right, to SIPs? And did you go for a thin insulation in the middle first?
Okay, SIPs are already insulated, but you have to be really careful what SIPs panels you use. We avoid EPS in the SIPs panels because of the fire issues, hence why we ended up using the Kingspan SIPs panels. Though there is a debate as to how good it is in terms of VOC output and so forth, because effectively using phonetic insulation, which a lot of people say isn't that great. You know, I'd love to use rock wool or something which is very ecological in this at this point. We can't. 5.5 metres limits for wall build-ups. The wall build-ups were limited to 300 mil. You know, really 320 at worst stage, I think. Space in London is a prime. Honestly, for us to put 0.5 metre thick walls, we wouldn't have got the house built. So that's one of the reasons we use SIPs panels. SIPs panels are thin, they're lightweight and very efficient. So the way we built this, we used 142 SIPs panels with insulation on the outside. And different places had different levels of insulation. That was governed by PHPP. Now, that changed the thicknesses of the build-ups in certain areas. The issue with the build-ups, you've got to be really, really careful here when you use SIPs panels. This is something I'd really strongly advise. Be really careful about insulating on the inside of SIPs panels. If you insulate on the inside of SIPs panels rather than on the outside, you can have interstitial condensation. So you have to do condensation risk analysis at this stage. Super important. If you don't do the condensation, there's a top tip here. If you use Kingspan, they'll use their service and you can actually get those guys to do all the risk analysis for you. But it's really important because if that's not done, then you can have a big problem and have a mushroom farm effectively on the inside of your walls. Yeah.
Why wouldn't you want it on the outside anyway? It sounds like the easy solution.
Right. I have a house made out of SIPs panel that I live in. I've got a little bit of insulation on the inside. I've got probably 20 mil or so behind the plasterboard. To get the U values to the level that you require, you need more. To put more insulation on the inside is where you end up with a risk of getting interstitial condensation. By building on the outside, what it means is you can very easily adhere brick slips to an outside because you've got OSB board. So putting insulation is an expense. You can also use thicker SIPs panels. You can use 172s. But all of this you need to think through and calculate before you actually start on site. Very important. You think it through. And it all needs to go into PHPP. Currently, for instance, we are working on a number of new passive houses. And we're working with PH Design. And that's one of the first, Design PH. Design PH is where we have a 3D model of a building. And as we're varying the window sizes, we can see what the wall thicknesses will do and so forth, because it links it directly with PHPP. Very useful tool for an architect or a designer at this stage. Really, really useful. Putting the insulation on the outside is much easier because it's easier to adhere to, it's easier to deal with air tightness, it's easier to deal with a lot of issues. But occasionally it's not possible, and that's why you might be putting it on the inside. For instance, if you're doing an existing building, there's no way you can insulate it on the outside if it's in a conservation area and it's brick. For instance, we've got one in Kennington, which we're doing as a Georgian house, and it's just got the NFIT certification. We couldn't do anything on the outside, so it all had to be done on the inside. Believe me, that was very difficult to achieve.
And the OSB isn't airtight, is it? So where does the airtightness line go?
Right, the OSB isn't airtight, but depending on who you use and who makes the SIPs panels, it can be. Kingspan's OSB is, yeah? So be really careful here. Now, I've seen a passive house in Romania. I went to one in Romania, and they'd use a cheaper panel, and it wasn't airtight. And it looked like someone had peppered it with a machine gun, because they were finding, when they were doing the air test, they were finding all sorts of leaks. So they were putting tape on it, and it looked a mess. With this particular system that we used, it was airtight through the OSB board and through the SIPs. Yeah.
Is this Kingspan Tech? Is that the name of it?
Kingspan Tech. We did put a membrane, an airtight membrane as well. We doubled up in certain places where we needed to. And we did do free air tests whilst we were building this building. So the cost of free air tests was in the builder's contract. And the first one we did was as soon as the building was erected, without the windows. So we had no windows, no doors, we just had the structural frame. We had done the foundations. The foundations were done first. Well, demolition foundations, that was a separate contract. Then we had the building arrive, it was erected, and then we taped up some membrane, just damp-proof membrane, over the windows, and we checked where it was leaking. And then we ensured that any leaks or any possible leaks, there weren't actually any leaks. There were some areas where it wasn't as airtight as we wanted it, but within a day it was. Yeah, so that's a really good tip. The next tip was when we put the windows in. At the point of installing the windows, we did another air test. Literally just after they were installed, again we could see that the windows weren't installed correctly. The windows were installed by the window manufacturer, who said they had experience in installing passive house windows. And I, as an architect, know how to install passive house windows, and I told them how to install passive house windows. They said, "Oh, of course we know." And they didn't install them correctly, and they had to all come out and be put in again. But the air test proved that the manufacturer had got it wrong. So really, be careful with things like this. I know that you need to bunny the tapes around the windows. You need to be very specific with what tape you use, whether it's Intello, whatever it is, whatever tape you're using, you need to make sure it's specifically for the purpose, and really, again, specify with whatever contract you're using, whether it's for window manufacturers who are doing it, or whether it's your main contractors installing the windows, that you're clear cut and you've got a piece of paperwork before you pay for it. These will be installed to whatever air tightness you want them to, and then have an air test afterwards, and then you can cross check it. Because without that, once the windows are in and you've started putting the plasterboard on, you're screwed. Absolutely, because then you've got to take a whole load of building fabric, waste a load of material, there's costs, there'll be all sorts of legal disputes and so forth. At this stage, we were really clear cut. The windows were put in, they were leaking, manufacturer came back, redid it, and he didn't even butter an eyelid about it. He just did it. He goes, "Oh, the wrong crew came down, they weren't our experienced crew," all sorts of excuses. But we had the evidence. Without that evidence, you are absolutely... You need that. So it's about getting your contract as tight as possible and making sure, even if it's only a single sheet of paper, you need to make sure all of these items are in there.
What was your contract?
Okay, for this particular project, we used two. We used the new Reba Domestic contract for the main building, and we had another Reba Domestic which we used for the foundations. But we coordinated it with the two contractors who are dealing with both aspects of the build. Then we also had a specific subcontractor, who Thomas Carter, who installed the SIPs panels, but that was under a Reba Domestic contract. Now, the Reba Domestic contract 2018 is pretty good. The one we used was for 2012 or 2014, I can't remember actually, but it was the older one, which is not as good. It's quite loose. And so the 2018 is a lot tighter. For us, that is now the right contract. If it's a bigger project, then we move on to intermediate contracts, but be really specific. We broke this into a number of separate contracts, and you'll hear also that our main contractor went bust sort of effectively halfway through the project. So that was also another issue. We noticed that the main contractor, who was a friend of the client's son, who we didn't actually put on the tender list, we were advising them to go to somewhere else, was asking for more and more money. We weren't allowing it. And eventually we realised he had other problems and he went bust. And that caused us a few issues. The client didn't really lose any money over this. They just lost a bit of time, probably about 4 months, when we were in the processes of stopping one contract and going through another one. And at that point, the son, who has got some development experience, decided to take on the same crew who had been working on the project, and he managed it, and he's now set up a building firm that we're working with. So he finished the contract off, and that's your protection. By having an architect, proper contract, you are quite protected should anything go wrong. This has happened to me in my 24-year career as an architect. I've had probably 4 or 5 cases of contractors going bust. And each time, the client hasn't been so out of pocket, but they've lost time. Because the contract protects you. Obviously,
is there anything you can do up front? I mean, it might be difficult. I know you do all your checks and stuff before tender, but anything else?
I do. And I do everything I can to check for various contractors, and I advise the clients. The company checks, speaking to people who've had stuff built. But for instance, I was working with a contractor for 10 years, and he was a very good contractor. This is a different project, and he had very good recommendations, very good approvals. He got in trouble with a VAT man, and he went bust halfway through it. Big £1 million project. It happens. Really good guy, been working donkey's years, got into trouble. So you don't always know. You might have amazing glowing references, fantastic track record. You might have known them for so long. You never know, and it's always quite difficult. So protection is something I would say is important. The other thing that you can do, you can insure for things like this, and you can put bonds in place, but it's very expensive and it's not really done that often. Also look at their turnover. Just look at their turnover and just look at the, company check is free if you use it on online initially. Just check people out.
What else do we need to know about this Muse project then? We know it was a tight budget. SIPs obviously very helpful. Anything else you're doing?
Right, the other aspects about this project, the project, we spent a lot of time working out the interiors. Libby wanted something which was incredibly palatial. She wanted something which was effectively a £500,000 house for a £250,000 budget, which we sort of delivered. I think we have in some ways. The bathrooms look like they're a lot more expensive. The way we did that was by looking at what she wanted and then trying to substitute materials which we could buy at a budget. So for instance, the tile she came to us with initially was about £50 a square metre. We found an alternative one for about £20 a square metre. In fact, I think it was less. It was about 18. She came to us with a really grand white Corian type staircase. We ended up making the staircase out of MDF and painting it white. That's
what you have to do, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So you design it in such a way that you work with the materials that you can afford, and then you come up with alternatives. The kitchen, for instance, we imported the kitchen from Italy, from a factory, so it's unbadged. I know the factories. I go to the Milan design show pretty much on a yearly basis. I talk to all the suppliers, and to send a truck over from Europe, I don't know what it's going to be like after Brexit, but to send a truck over from Europe to the UK, a big truck is about €2,000, or it used to be. And so a lot of the interiors was one of the items that we spent a lot of time shopping around, making sure that all the systems worked well. And but one of the problems that I would say avoid buying each individual piece on the eBay. That proves to be an absolute nightmare. I have clients who've done that in the past. They go, oh yeah, I can get this on eBay or whatever, a lot cheaper. The problem is you're going to have to store it somewhere, right? So unless you've got a very cheap storage place where you can store it and you can fundamentally say that all these parts are there, because you've got different fixes that are necessary. At first fixed stage, you'll need the different components to go into the walls, then at second fixed stage. And when you're going to be storing this somewhere, the likelihood is you'll lose the cover for something or whatever. So allow the builder and the contractor to get these items, or if you are, working with an architect or a coordinator, or like what we consider ourselves as contract administrators as well as architects, then we deal with those sort of items. Other items here, so the interior was, we really thought about that a lot. We had a few very specialist bespoke items, such as the front garage doors, which roll back. That was a specialist item. We had another very specialist item, which was the deck to the swimming pool, which is like a Thunderbird's deck. The deck basically rolls across and slides across after you put the key in the lock, and then all of a sudden you've got a swimming pool at the back there. And otherwise it's a floor deck. That's the entire back garden. So that was quite complicated, and we managed to get an engineer for about $8,000 to do all the engineering for that, which is fantastic. So just think of those other items which are a little bit more complex. For instance, for us here, other complex issues was the roof lights. How do we make the roof lights work with the glazing without spending an absolute fortune? And we worked with a company that we worked with before. We designed the roof light to sit in foam glass. So we did all the thermal bridging calculations. So the roof light sits in this foam glass sandwich. And then at the front, we've got the window which comes up to this foam glass. And then we got stepped glazing, which hits another bit of stepped glazing, and it's sealed with a silicon seal. Now that's something we developed, and it was our R&D which went into this to make sure that the up and over type roof light worked, and it does work. Though the first time we did it, the client. This was after the first builder went bust. We realised that the first builder who went bust had actually ordered double glazing for the roof light as opposed to triple. And we'd spec'd out triple. We went on site, we saw it, and we thought, hang on, this is double glazed. And we thought, hang on, how's this going to work? And he'd obviously tried to save some money. It was about $2,000, but we had to take both roof lights out. And then now those roof lights are quadruple glazed because we bought another double glazed unit and put it in underneath that. So we've actually got we've got a quadruple glazed roof light there. So we upped its performance, but we had to take the unit out and then put it back in and drop it into the foam glass and then seal up the roof. So there's all sorts of little tricks. The other thing that's important with anything where there's a tricky situation, passive house. Passive house isn't complex. It's more a question of keeping an eye on the builder. So what I mean by this is be careful when you go to site and make sure that you've got someone who's got experience, who's cross-checking what the builder is doing. Because if you move past a stage where it's too late to fix it, that's where it can get really expensive. Whilst if someone is checking it throughout the process or at certain crucial stages, like for instance, we hadn't plastered the full the ceilings, and we suddenly realised that we got double glazing instead of triple glazing. We managed to nip that, to nip it really effectively. And we didn't have huge costs involved in replacing those units and adding to them. We had a few issues like that. There were a few tricky ones. The other really tricky one with this was the services. So the original builder said, oh, yes, we've put the notices into the water board and to the electricity board. He'd given us a receipt and everything, so we paid his deposits, only to find out that they surveyed it and they said they couldn't do it. So when we'd actually come to trying to get the water and the gas and the electric connected, that took a long time because we almost had to start again because it's a private road. So they said they could take it to the bottom of the road, and then we had 3 houses from the bottom of the road to our house going across private land. And we managed to deal with that through good neighbourly communication, really. And that was done. We hired metal plates to put on the roads when we were digging it up so people could get past. So we'd dig it up very quickly in a section, lay the pipes. So there are complexities. And finding someone you can trust, you can work with is so important.
Just finally then, how has this all gone down with Elizabeth, and any learnings that you've had as this fits into your portfolio of projects?
Elizabeth absolutely loves her house. She loves it. She had a big issue about downsizing. Going from a 5 or 6 bedroom house that she's lived most of her life in to a 3-bedroom tiny house. Well, it's not tiny, it's small. Maybe tiny is a bit of an exaggeration. But everything's thought through here. So, the kitchen goes into the living room. There's doors that slide into walls. So it's a bit like an aircraft. The toilet under the stairs has a washing machine in it, which goes under the stairs. There's a laundry basket above that. Everything's been thought through. She loves it, absolutely. Learning experiences from it, I suppose, for me, as a practice, don't listen to clients when they come up with builders' ideas if you're not very sure that builder's any good. My first meeting, I wasn't keen on the builder, but the clients knew him and he was a friend. I just thought he was a bit of a... Well, when he turned up in his really flash car, like 60 grand Porsche, I just thought to myself, nah. And apparently he was an ex-footballer as well. And, I just thought to myself...
I don't think I've ever heard of a builder turning up in a Porsche.
Well, this guy did, and maybe, he was quite a... Yeah. And I just thought to myself, I'm not sure about this. The next thing here really is be strong with your ideals. Stick to your ideals. I stuck with Passive House. There was many a time when the client wanted to tell me to sod off not do it. And there was many times, and I know that Libby did come to it. Now she absolutely loves it. And she wouldn't bat an eyelid about doing it again, I don't think, as a Passive House. Her son is doing other projects with us now, and he's learnt from this, so it's a huge learning experience. We've learnt a lot about construction. We've learnt a lot about how the brick slips, because this was done with brick slips, how they adhere to the walls. I mean, there's a lot of R&D for us on this project. So, effectively, our hours were at least 3 times the amount of hours that we should be charging for. Yeah, so effectively for us, we made a loss on the project as a practice. But for us, it's a huge research game because there's a huge amount of information I've learnt from it. There's other projects that will benefit. We're doing a housing estate at the moment as well. For 2022, we're doing a fairly big, which is likely to be passive as well. And one of the things that I have learnt from this, and one of the other items, is Passive House is a fantastic system, but don't let you be swayed by just Passive House rules and regulations and what you can and what you can't do. Basically, you can do anything as long as you've got an architect who understands what Passive House is about. You can design pretty much any sort of building you want to and apply the principles to it. And I think that's really important. One of the problems that I do find with people saying this is Passive House, this is not Passive House, this is really what you're trying to do is approach a problem, a design problem, and make that design problem the best solution you can possibly achieve for the client. Now, Passive House comes into it as a bit of physics, which is probably about 10% of the problem. The rest of the problem is to make the bloody house work and make it work for your client. That's an architect's problem. And I think that is something that you need to really think through rather than say, I want to design myself a Passive House. No, the problem is, what do you want? How many kids are going to live there? What's the house for? Is it for you? Are you going to be staying there? Are you planning on selling it? What's the longevity of this house? Is it going to stay there for another 100 years? All of this sort of stuff. Think it through. Think what you want out of it. Think whether it's going to be left for yourself, for your children. Are you going to be selling it in 7 years' time? Do you need a 10-year warranty on it? All these sort of things you need to think through.
Well, Richard, I've really appreciated all these insights today. Thank you very much.
Good. I'm glad. Thank you.
Go into more detail online at houseplanninghelp.com/237 today. We've made a summary of everything that's been talked about. You can check out some photos of the build. I get the impression that Richard likes high quality photos. They sell a project, don't they? And the interiors looking smashing as well. If you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, then scroll down to the bottom of the show notes. You can leave it there. We'll link you across to RDA, houseplanninghelp.com/237. finally today, I wanted to ask you, have you left us an iTunes review? We haven't put a shout out for this for a while, and that's probably why we haven't had many reviews. But if you've enjoyed this podcast, if you've got value from today's episode, any of the episodes in our archive, I'd really appreciate an honest review. It's very easy to do. Once you're in the iTunes store, you find our podcast and there's a button that says write a review. Positive review will bump us up in the rankings, and we would really like that and really help us out. So if you can do that, head to the iTunes store and leave us a review. Next time, we've got the first in a few international podcasts. We haven't done these for a while because we've been very focused throughout my own build. I've wanted to keep it UK, but it makes sense now. We've got a bit of time. Let's go international. So Adam Cohen from Build Smart is my guest, and we're going to be talking about making passive house homes affordable. That's your lot for today. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.